Off video.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are just going to give it a few minutes while people log on. So bear with us and we will start promptly in about a minute or two. We have a great hour lined up. So just give us a moment and we will be with you. We'll give it one more minute because I do see some people continuing to log on. So just a few more seconds. Okay, I think we should start kicking it off. All right, guys, it's right at 2 o'clock right now. So people, as they join in, will get this underway because we've lots to cover. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paula Oreskevich. I'm the Communications Director for California Wines Canada. On behalf of all of us here today, Danielle Giroux, Celeste Finn, and myself, we'd like to welcome you to the 5th edition of the California Wine Somm Session, featuring these amazing wines and vineyard personalities from Kistler, Occidental, Groth, and Turley Vineyard wineries. Today, we, along with our partner, the Vine Agency, present an in-depth exploration of 4 of California's key varietals. We would like to give special thanks to Rob Groth, Alex Gaunt, and Anthony Demas at the Vine for being such great partners to work with and for all of their hard work behind the scenes. We'd also like to thank all of the vintners for joining us as well. We also would like to congratulate the Vine on celebrating their 20th anniversary in business last year. So well done, Rob and Ann. Congratulations. We're also excited to have Chris Waters here with us today. Many of you know Chris already. He is a wine educator and he's the wine columnist for the Canada's Globe and Mail national newspaper. Chris will lead the panel with principals from 4 iconic wineries, each identified with a specific grape. So please join Chris today in conversation with Jeff Labitska, Master of Wine, Director of Sales, Marketing, Kistler Vineyards, Catherine Kistler, winemaker at Occidental Winery, Suzanne Groth, President and CEO, Groth Vineyards and Winery, and Tegan Pasalacqua, winemaker at Turley Wine Cellars. Our esteemed panelists will share their insights and passions for proprietary clones of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, the terroir of Oakville, and heritage plantings of Zinfandel, among many other things. So can't wait for this highly informative session. Featured wines today that we'll be tasting will be the 2018 Kistler Chardonnay from Sonoma Mountain, the Occidental 2019 Pinot Noir from Freestone Occidental on the Sonoma Coast, the Groth 2016 Cabernet from Oakville and Napa Valley, and the Turley 2018 Zinfandel from Groth Vineyard and Paso Robles. But before I hand it over to the team to get started, just wanted to share a few housekeeping items with you all. So as attendees, you will all be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you'll see on your screen, there are 2 channels for you to communicate with other attendees and pose questions to the panelists. First is the chat section. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other guests, but just be sure to select everyone, all panelists and attendees in the to field, as sometimes it defaults to the panelists only section. Secondly, the Q&A section. This is where we ask you to please submit any questions you may have for the panel to be answered during the webinar. If you find yourself to have streaming issues, you may want to encourage other members of your office or household to log off the internet to avoid simultaneous streaming to save some bandwidth. Or you may also want to log out and try again with another internet service such as Firefox or Chrome. This webinar is being recorded and all of you will receive a link to the video recording and tasting notes in the following days. So you're all really ready for a treat today. So let's get started. Let's escape to California wine country for the next hour. And I'm going to turn this over to Chris Waters to take it away. Thanks everyone and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Paula. The hard part for me today would be time management. We've got 4 absolute titans who've got so much to share. about a place that I think firmly registered in our head and our heart, but a place we haven't been able to visit, toe touch, for obvious reasons. And so here's our chance to connect, find out what's happening, but also I thought it would be really fun to revisit some of the stories, the origin stories that shaped and influenced wine culture in general. I mean, that's the main thing. And I think less you hear from me, the more you actually hear from these panelists. So I'm going to cut my preamble very, very short and tap Jeff to get prepared. I should also mention that Brent Fraser is waiting in the wings. I'm going to throw to him a couple times just to talk to the wines, specifically the Pinot Noir and the Zinfandel. Brent must have drawn a short straw somewhere, lost a bet, but he's on the hook for waxing poetic about these wines right in front of the winemaker, and they can thumbs up or thumbs down, and maybe we'll eject him. Who knows what will happen to Brent? That's the best part. I think there's slime involved at some point. But Jeff, one of the things that really strikes me in this moment in time, 2021, California Chardonnay, it feels like there's nothing new under the sun. Perhaps it feels like it's self-assured. It's an iconic style, but my take on it is it's an iconic style because people like Kistler in the origin story did the heavy lifting to make it so. It didn't just happen. It was a whole lot of sweat and effort and determination that went into making California Chardonnay into the viable entity that it's true. I'm hoping I'm correct, or you can just say no and we'll just end.
You're correct. Nothing is by accident necessarily. All the great brands that everybody tries to copy in the wine world started out with the vision of one individual usually. I mean, when you look at, let's take Zinfandel by the glass, for example. When you look at Ravenswood, that wasn't a proven entity when he started. And similarly, when Kistler was founded in 1978, Chardonnay was not a proven entity. I'm aware of this because I started in the wine business in 1978, and I grew up down in Southern California in Orange County. And at the time, the Orange County Fair was really one of the preeminent, the best judging for wine from the United States in the United States. That was where California wines got their recognition before the Wine Spectator and before Robert Parker came on the scene, and there were a few other wine writers, but most of the wine writers were from the United Kingdom. Nobody really, as you pointed out, Chris, nobody really knew whether Chardonnay was going to be the next Gamay or what it is today, being the most popular variety in the United States by far. In 1978, when Steve Kistler planted the original vineyard on the Mayacamas Mountains on the backside of Napa, there were only about 2,500 acres of Chardonnay in Sonoma County in 1978, a few that were non-bearing. Today, there's 91,000 acres in Sonoma County and 170,000 acres in California. So really shows, but when you look at it back then, there was almost as much Carignan planted in Sonoma County as Chardonnay. A bottle of Chardonnay in California in 1978 sold for about $6 a bottle. And that was the best Chardonnays. That was Stony Hill, that was Chalone, that was Mount Eden Vineyards, that, the Hansel. Those were the very best. Those are the ones that Robert Lawrence Balzer was writing up as the best Chardonnays from California. But it certainly was not a proven entity at all. But it came at a time when the tastes were changing in the United States. You had a lot of baby boomers that grew up drinking Kool-Aid and Coca-Cola. They liked their beverages cold. It was when kids weren't allowed to drink coffee, so the flavors of bitter weren't there. And they started out drinking wine, drinking white wine, sweet wine, and cold wine. So if you looked at what was really popular then, it was things like Beringer Chenin Blanc. It wasn't necessarily people were running out looking for Chardonnay. When there was the Great Judgment of Paris, I remember my brother's friends who were wine drinkers and wine collectors, they weren't looking for Montelena Chardonnay. They were looking for Stag's Leap Cabernet. So the movie really plays the Chardonnay card, But back then, Chardonnay was just getting started. Beaulieu, which was one of the most famous wineries in California, called their Chardonnay Pinot Chardonnay. That doesn't happen anymore. So Mark and Steve met actually at Mark Bixler and Steve Kistler met at Fresno. They were part of a tasting group, and they were tasting the great wines of the day. They were tasting red Burgundy, white Burgundy, Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa, but that was about it in the California scene. They were tasting red Bordeaux and white Bordeaux, and really, a bottle of Pouilly-Fuissé sold for $17.99, and the best Chardonnays from California sold for $6. Today, Kistler Chardonnay sells for about $100, and Pouilly-Fuissé still sells for about $17. So it's a very interesting transition that Chardonnay has made. If you want to flip to the next slide with the maps, the real, as you were talking, Chris, the real image in my mind is vision. And Steve Kistler started out with a vision to make Chardonnay that would show the transparency of the vineyard right through to the glass that you're drinking. And so it wasn't just, the Kistler vineyard was planted. There was still wine to be made because, you got about 5 or 6 years before you get your first wine from that vineyard. And so Steve developed relationships with some of the best growers in North Bay or the North Coast, Lee Hudson, Larry Hyde, and the Dutton family, and later Durrell Vineyard. And the idea of working with those vineyard owners to kind of really get to the best site in their larger vineyard, it was about a 30-year mission. And today we really have the best blocks in Hudson, Durrell, and Hyde. We took over the management of Mccrae Vineyard, which is in the Sonoma Valley. And that was in the mid-1980s, but that had been farmed since the 1970s. Within all of these vineyards, if you want to flip to the next slide, we have our own proprietary clone of Chardonnay that's resident in all those vineyards. And it's something that Steve developed using a Burgundian technique called selection massal. And if you look at that cluster of grapes, this is an actual size comparison. It's about 4 or 5 times the size of a cork. And some of those berries are downright tiny and they don't have seeds at all. And other berries are a bit larger. But the blend of the two different sized berries gives you a strong acidity and really depth and structure, but lower yields and higher acidity. The soil types, this is just the difference in soil types between the organic volcanic sections of the Mccrae Vineyard and the limestone chalky sections of the Mccrae Vineyard. But there's different soil types throughout every single vineyard that we get our Chardonnay from. So when you get into the vineyards in the western part of Sonoma County at Vine Hill, it's almost pure sand, finer sand than you would find at the local beaches. So there's a different characteristic that each one of these sites imparts into the Chardonnay flavor. The winemaking, Steve Kistler was part of a group of winemakers in California that really were focusing on Chardonnay, and that was the name of the conference that they started in the late 1980s called Focus on Chardonnay. And it was Robert Haas of Vineyard Brands, who was involved with Sonoma-Cutrer, that hosted the first conference, and that was in Sonoma County. And then later on, a year later, they were in Beaune. And some of the greatest producers of white Burgundy were involved at the time. I remember Steve saying that Koch of Turley mentioned to him that some of the most interesting wines of white wines that were made in Burgundy were made in vintages that were very warm right after harvest. And if you think about Burgundy in the 70s, temperature control was you open up you open up the doors of the winery or the barn in the spring, so you finish malolactic fermentation. So we experimented with different temperatures. We ferment a bit warmer Everything is unfined, unfiltered. It's not cold settled. It's not cold stabilized. So the winemaking really is part and parcel to, it's very similar to how great Burgundy was made in the 70s, and all those tools, they weren't there for a lot of the tiny domains that were making the great age-worthy wines. The vision was passed on to Jason Kestner, who's our winemaker and president today. Jason and Steve worked together at the Hudson Vineyard for about 10 years before Jason was hired at Kistler, and they worked together in the vineyards and in the winemaking, beginning with an apprenticeship that Jason had, and evolving into Jason becoming assistant winemaker and winemaker at Kistler. And we pay great homage to the 40 years and the decisions made in those 40 years that Steve made, that we are benefiting from now. And our vision today, which continues, is how do we do the same kind of, how do we apply the same kind of scrutiny to every wine that we're making for the next 40 years? We want somebody to look back 40 years from now and say, hey, I'm glad they made that decision. And the decisions that we're making today, many of the Chardonnay vineyards as we go forward are vineyards either with a very trusted grower, like the Dutton family, or where we are actually managing the vineyard entirely. And we have some new vineyard property that we're managing entirely. And the wine you're tasting right now is the Mccrae Vineyard, which there's been increased scrutiny as we've gone through new plantings with the replanting some of the sections of Mccrae Vineyard. There's actually a section that used to be planted of Pinot Noir, but hasn't been for about 10 or 15 years. This particular vineyard has, as you saw in the last slide, it has these big chunks of limestone chalk in the soil, which deliver kind of a chalky minerality and a mineral-like structure, and with the exchange have more of an acid-driven finish in the wine. And the more organic soil, the volcanic soil, which is not unlike the soil of the original vineyard, it's more red, it has volcanic stone and loam, gives a bit more of a broad-shouldered Chardonnay that that perhaps is a bit earlier drinking than some of our single vineyard wines. But there hasn't been, as far as, this isn't the situation where you've got a new winemaker that's coming in. The relationship between Jason and Steve went about 18, 19 years, and great homage is continuing to that. 2018 was a kind of a potentially very plentiful vintage in terms of quantity, but there was a lot of fruit being dropped in our vineyards. We were kind of scared about overcropping. It was the first vintage that kind of benefited from the standpoint of California coming out of those drought years. So 2017 was not a drought year, but the amount of grapes we got were determined in 2016. So we were worried, and we dropped a lot of fruit. So our yields were quite low. We retained a lot of acidity in the wine. And you'll see that this wine has a deep kind of golden color, green tinge. We make the wine in a kind of reductive fashion, even though it's barrel fermented. And there's a part of the wine that wants a little oxygen. And sometimes when you open it up, you get a little bit of a green tinge to it. Bone dry, unfiltered, unfined. Sometimes when you chill it down too cold, it might throw some tartrate crystals. If it gets a tiny bit warm, it might be a little bit hazy. But natural wine aging potential of this wine is probably 5 years or more. And the Mccrae, I've had Mccrae actually the oldest Mccrae I've had was in Canada, and that was like 1991, and it was still going strong. So I think with that, I'm out of time. I'm glad you didn't bring out the hook.
Well, no, and I don't want to. I'm going to put the hook away just for a second, because one of the things that, so much of the New World, so much of California has been built on adopting best practices from the old world, from Burgundy, and adapting them to make sense. And so a lot of that benchmarking, I love the simplicity of Just imagine if the Focus on Chardonnay conference was held now, it would have some fanciful poetic name, but no, this is a focus on Chardonnay. This is what we're doing. But I want to know about now, the next 40 years, where the big sweeping changes, everything's been dialed in, locked in. You're now talking about nth degree stuff to move the needle in any way, shape, or form. That's when determination becomes really dogged. How do you keep that attention to detail when you have arrived, when you may be considered, you are an icon within the realm? How do you benchmark yourself? How do you keep that determination going?
Well, with Chardonnay in particular, we don't ever want to take our eye off the ball on what got us here in the first place. And so the decisions, some of those decisions that I was talking about, there's a vineyard that we were farming for the Splan family called Trenton Roadhouse. We planted that vineyard in 1992. We didn't make our first single vineyard wine until 2009. I can tell you that economically, most growers around the Sonoma County that buy a vineyard, they won't wait 17 years to put a single vineyard name on that. And that particular block has to prove itself for several years before we bottled our newest single vineyard Chardonnay that we bottle as Laguna Ridge Chardonnay. We bottle it only in magnums. We only make 500 cases. It may have the best aging potential of any of the Western vineyards that we have, but that vineyard was being farmed for about 12 years. And there was a lot of back and forth between Steve and Jason before they both decided that, okay, the time was right and it was ready to bottle that. And then in 2017, a big portion of that vineyard got grafted over from Pinot Noir to Chardonnay. And the irony is we kind of need more Pinot Noir, but that's been the thing with Pinot Noir is it's been taken out of probably more vineyards than we have currently planted. But the greatest decision I think that was made over the years was at the original Kistler vineyard. And in 1993, Steve had been making Cabernet Sauvignon there for 5 or 6 years, and decided that, in his words, it was unremarkable. I've tasted some of those Cabernets, and I would say I would not agree that it was unremarkable. I think that there were some very good wines, but on a comparison basis, it was on a quality level like La Laguna in Bordeaux, and that wasn't. Kistler had the vision to make first growth wine or Grand Cru level wine. And so it wasn't, if we had been judged today based on our Cabernet Sauvignon, it might be a different world for our Chardonnay. So those are the kind of great decisions that you look back on and you say, we got to stay true to our vision. We got to ignore the economics because there's very few Chardonnays that are in the same space of branding and of quality, and there's zero in the United States that are in that same space that are producing the quantity of wine at the level on the single vineyard wines, because we'll make about 1,000 cases of an individual single vineyard wine, and there's others that are at quality level, but usually driven by economics, it can only be a couple hundred cases because it just doesn't make sense for that. So we're in a very fortunate position, and even with what I do from the marketing standpoint, it's my job not to screw it up, and because it has been so thought out. And Pinot Noir is still evolving. Our Pinot Noir is a different style than Occidental, and I like where we're going, but we're more in a Volnay style, and Pinot Noir is one of those things that. We may be 10 years before the next single vineyard Pinot Noir comes out. It's like we're sitting down and making decisions knowing that I might not even be in the building when those sites evolve to being the first single vineyard wine. And that's the way it's always been. And with great homage to really paying attention to it, you don't fix something that is this great. You just kind of make sure you guide it through and keep moving in the direction that the path started out with. And that's kind of the mantra around the winery in total. It doesn't mean we aren't planting new vineyards. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be, but our growth is not going to be There will never be a Kistler coastal Chardonnay. I mean, it'll never happen. So it's not. It will never be corporate. And I think Steve was also very thoughtful about who he sold the winery to and who he brought on as assistant winemaker, because he probably could have made a lot more money selling it to Constellation or to another large entity, and they would have been interested. But Bill Price, this is a legacy that he wants to have his children involved in some way at some point. So this is not just an investment for future profit. Let's put it that way. It's more of a passion for great wine.
Wow, nicely said. And so, yeah, I think it's true that, yeah, if you're going to be introducing something into a rarefied field of single vineyards with pedigree, you need to have some runs on the board before you can push something into the big leagues. And you did a great job for me getting the transition ready for Catherine Kistler, because it's you've just paved the way and said Pinot Noir more times than almost as many times as you said Chardonnay. So thank you, Jeff. I'm sure there's going to be questions, so sit tight. Please don't go anywhere. But Catherine, I wanted to bring you into this conversation.
And Catherine, I'm using the proper glassware.
Yeah, we're on the same page, Jeff. We're on the same page. No, thanks for the introduction and for having me today. I think where Jeff left things is a great place for me to pick up and sort of go into why Pinot Noir, and going from, if you remember Jeff's map, by the mid 90s, my dad was farming or working with growers from Sonoma Mountains, Sonoma Valley, Russian River, Sonoma Coast. I mean, the world was vast in terms of the various sites that they were producing single vineyard Chardonnays from. But something caught his eye in the early 90s, and it was a 92 vintage Summa vineyard from William Sellium, Pinot Noir, that, if you guys are familiar with Rivers Marie, who produces a Summa, but at the time it was William Sellium and a group of vineyards on a little road sort of about 3 miles from where I'm sitting here called Taylor Lane, where the Terriot vineyard that Literai Farms is as well. This Pinot Noir was unlike anything he was making at Kistler at the time, which I think I can safely say was a little bit more high octane, riper stuff. This was salty and fresh and bright, and sort of perked his ears a little bit, and got him thinking about what could be next in terms of producing Pinot Noir. At that point, he'd been making beautiful Chardonnays for over 20 years. So if any of you have ever met my dad or talked to my dad, he's always thinking about what's next, and is a perfectionist and loves making wine more than anything else in the world. So I think for him, the idea of a challenge was super appealing. He felt, he'd pretty well in hand, had Chardonnay well in hand. And so I can talk a little bit about this area and why this would be a challenge specifically for Pinot really quickly. So our Occidental Vineyards, all 85 acres of estate vineyard that we have, and our winery, okay, perfect, yeah, are just under 5 miles from the Pacific Ocean here. So this clump of vineyards on the map is on a west-southwest facing ridge where there's nothing higher than we are facing the ocean. And that original Summa vineyard is sort of up in the woods to the upper left corner, just by a little bit. And so when you're out here, it's nasty in the summer. It's foggy and wet, and it's 55 degrees and it's cold, right? And so when you have a thin-skinned grape like Pinot Noir, your emphasis is on farming. You're battling mold, and canopy management is the name of the game out here. So it was no easy decision for us, I guess, to go all in with 85 acres out here to be the core of Occidental. But I think the trade-off and what you get in terms of these really bright, salty, marine influenced wines that can't come from anywhere else. They taste that way. They're not, they're very red fruited and oh cool. Yeah. I'm not like Jeff. Jeff was very prepared and had all the slides printed out. So I'm excited to see what's next on my deck here. But you know, for us, we want these wines to be that like crystalline red, salty character that's almost impossible to produce on warmer sites farther inland. And just like with the Chardonnay clone, what you see here is a Massal selection of our Pinot Noir as well. So selected for hens and chicks, lots of tiny berries, you know, roughly 50-gram clusters or so, many of which don't have seeds. And so what he was always selecting for was that skin to juice ratio. And I think, you know, giving us that structure and really intense color. The 19 Freestone Occidental that you guys have in front of you should be vibrant, it's bright. And I can talk a little bit about 18 and 19 here. Yeah, so the Bodega Headlands Vineyard is the first site that he planted out here starting in 99. So it's really cool for us to have, you know, over 20-year-old vines that he first bottled at Kistler, and then Occidental's first vintage was 11 actually. So this vineyard came over to Occidental with us when our brand started. And he was, I mean, he kept a foot in both ponds for a little while there. He stayed on at Kistler until the end of 2017, directing farming and you know, the winemaking operations there alongside Jason, and was making all of the Pinot Noirs here at Occidental during that time as well. So rather than, you know, selling to Constellation and riding off into the sunset, he wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So he's now devoting all of his time working with me here at Occidental. What should I say about the wine? So for us, our winemaking process is also really simple. And I think we felt really lucky that, as Jeff said, 18 was a really beautiful vintage out here, as was 19. And something that we've been thinking about for many years, and because it's so difficult to farm out here, sort of don't always get the chance to do, is pick at your leisure. And in 18 and 19, temperatures turned cool right around harvest time for roughly 10 days, which let us get all of our acreage in sort of at our own pace, picking fewer tons per day. So it meant that we could sort really slowly. And from there, the benefit for us is keeping all of our tiny little Pinot Noir berries intact. So we're picking at night, we're picking into smaller bins, all by hand, bringing that to the winery and then sorting, if any of you have worked production, about 1.5 tons per hour, which is very slow. So lots of long days on the sorting line. And by keeping the berries intact, we're actually able to sort of move away from our interest in whole cluster necessarily. Before, these like really lifted, bright aromatics and flavors were something that are more commonly associated with a whole cluster ferment. And for us, because we have the cold fruit we've picked at night with basically no juice, we have this cold core in the center of our fermenters that's absorbing the heat of fermentation, and the same way the stems do, but isn't imparting this like vegetal character. And as a result, the 19 Freestone Occidental is a great example. That wine is electric and ultraviolet and so purely fruit driven and salty. And I think that's definitely the style of wine that interests us. That's the style of wine I like to drink when I go out to dinner. I know my dad likes to drink when we go out. So I think it's a perfect marriage of the vintage coming together in the right way for us to make the style of wines we want to make, and to continue to push the envelope in terms of what we're curious about in the winery too. Extended vatting, you know, after fermentation. I won't get too far in the weeds, but we're all native yeast ferments. We don't own a press still, so minimal punch downs. Every tank's allowed to sort of proceed at its own rate through fermentation. You know, no refrigeration if we don't have to of those tanks. And then, you know, 25% new oak and only a year in barrel, and MLs, unfined, unfiltered, all that good stuff. So we're on the right track here. I'd be happier to be alongside him as assistant winemaker. And That's my spiel.
Yeah, no, it's a good spiel. We lost you a little bit there. I just had one question. I'm going to ask a question to get Brent ready for singing for his supper in a second. But picking decisions. This is one of the things, you know, because you are looking for, I think you used the word crystalline. If you didn't, you should have, because the wine just sings. And that's what I love, the purity of it.
I did.
What's the ratio? What are you looking for? Is it all flavor? Is there some science? Is it just what's your motivation to call the picking window?
Good question. So it's what we like to call the
Brent, we might get you to take while we try and get a more stable.
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about
ready to go at 21.5 bricks for blocks. I mean, it's
We're back.
worked on for all these years. Is my internet being slow?
Yeah, we keep losing you.
Bad?
It's not as crystalline as the wine, unfortunately.
Oh no,
We keep dropping out.
that's so strange. Can you hear me okay now?
You are perfect right now. Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, so our picking decisions are based on flavor and on acid more than anything else. And I was just trying to say that 2020 was a perfect example of where that benefited us, and our clonal material benefited us in that we have stuff that's ripe at very low sugars that would be, you know, next to impossible in warmer sites inland. So, you know, our cooler days, warmer nights thing by being by the coast helps us in that. But for us, it's much more flavor and acid and not really worried about the sugar. Where the wine's going to taste beautiful no matter what we're picking it at bricks wise.
No, love the style and love the Rob just put into the, you know, welcome to the wilds of the Sonoma Coast. Yeah, I love that you're kind of writing the history of this parcel of the land by observing it so closely. Brent, what are you seeing in the glass? How are we in a good place here? I think so.
I think this is outstanding. One of the things that always strikes me about, you know, these Sonoma Coast Pinots, and, you know, I started going there about 20 years ago, and you know, the Russian River Barrel Weekend was always something that I would try and get out for. You started seeing examples of these really, you know, almost wild, sort of very vibrant, you know, as you were saying, crystalline styles of wines that were coming out from these pioneers over on the West Coast. And if you ever sort of drive out to like Bodega Bay or Jenner or those places, I mean, you know, with the roads, it's so windy, you can't actually get there. It takes about an hour, but it's so cold, and the fog that stays there, I think the fog rolls in, you know, in the evening, stays there until sometimes sort of, you know, early morning or afternoon. And you really get that in the wine. I didn't hear, Catherine, what you said about barrel, but I get very little, you know, there's a hint of some barrel here, but it is all about this, for me, wild, sort of vibrant red fruit character.
Yeah, we're only at around 25% new oak now. So a big difference than before.
No, that's great. Well said, Brent. And stay close, Catherine. Hope the wind doesn't blow you away. Keep with us. Keep with the internet, and we'll teleport to Oakville and into Napa. And welcome, Suzanne, into that. I feel like I'm not nearly lit as well, and I realize it's like I was overly California casual. I'm not even wearing a collar. Brent's making me look like a schlub here. What? It's
Hi.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting us today. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, we just had a release of Groth, as you probably full well know, at the LCBO. It's supposed to be ongoing, but of course there is a stampede for this grape variety that you're about to talk to us about. So I think it's a good place to hear about Cabernet from yourself.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of my fellow vintners for reaching out. We have missed talking to each other so much. This is not the format we usually prefer. I I think I was joking earlier with maybe Tegan, let's meet down at Anna's Cantina in downtown St. Helena, as opposed to just passing off bottles in our parking lots. But I really appreciate that my fellow vintners got me a sample of all of these wines, because I haven't tasted Kistler. Well, okay, I should preface that I didn't get to taste Kistler. I was a sales rep for Henry Wine Group, the distributor in Northern California for Kistler. I would allocate with an eyedropper to the lucky recipients of Kistler. I, as a lowly salesperson, never tasted it, so I'm so excited to be able to share. Jeff, thank you so much. And Catherine, I'm so excited by your wine. Salty is, yeah, I'm so glad you said that. Because man, once you said it, I'm like, I'm sitting at the coast, I'm looking at Bodega Bay, and I'm loving the flavors. So thank you guys for sharing. And I'm excited to taste Tegan's wine too, because Turley has lore in Napa, obviously. You know, Groth is kind of a latecomer. I always feel a little bit like a schlub, right? You know, my parents arrived in 1981. Dennis and Judy Groth are founders and my partners today. They were young, they were 39 years old the year they bought 121 acres in Oakville, right in the middle of Napa Valley. And I was 8 years old, 10 years old, the year they came up to Napa and started looking around. There's my little Oakville map there. This kind of, I also refer to this as the name dropping map because, you know, gosh, mention some neighbors like Opus One, you know, some newer arrivals, you know, Mr. Harlan, of course, Jean Phillips from Screaming Eagle, no schlub herself with her Screaming Eagle Vineyard, but then little gems that nobody's ever heard of. And I always like to tell their story, and it's part of our story in being Oakville neighbors is, you know, the Today family who farmed here in Oakville near the Tokelon estate on the west side there, west of the highway. You can't even see it because it's sitting where Robert Mondavi is. But Tokelon and Oakville have this range with Cabernet Sauvignon sometimes we forget to mention. So, you know, prior to Prohibition, even in the 1860s, there were people growing Cabernet Sauvignon here. The Sullinger Ranch, Tokelon Estate were established in the late 1800s. And it wasn't until Bob Mondavi built the first new winery in Napa Valley in 1962. That's the first new post-Prohibition winery in Napa Valley. So it takes us the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and on until Napa Valley is like pulling itself out of the doldrums. You know, families did everything to survive. This particular ranch, its history was in dairy. So there was a dairy farmer here until 1970. It wasn't until Justin Meyer comes along with Ray Duncan, they're quietly running a little operation in a barn across the street called Silver Oak, making Cabernet Sauvignon. They didn't break ground on their winery until 1982. But Justin, without Justin being here, putting the first vitis vinifera in this soil, there would be no Groth because it wouldn't have been here. There was Cabernet on this property. There was Napa Gamay and Riesling and some other wacky stuff that wasn't doing well here in Oakville. The frost was killing any other varietal and it was not doing so good. So it was available for sale by the time my crazy parents arrived from San Jose. My dad had a day job at Atari. I know any of your listeners, you know, if they're my age and older, I'm 50, so they know what Atari is. For you younger people, I apologize. It came after pinball and before Nintendo. So there you go. It was the very first video game company, so I thought it was very cool, of course. But Atari had kind of a short, fast ride for my dad. He was a finance guy there, and it didn't do well when they introduced a game called E.T., and we got, you know, expelled from Silicon Valley. E.T. was a terrible flop in the market, an exciting movie, but terrible video game. I would like to go on record here that my younger brother and I, Andrew, were the test market. We told him it was a terrible game, but nobody believed it, the little kids. So we ended up in Napa Valley by the time I'm in high school. St. Helena is only 12 minutes away, but man, it was a rural place filled with kids that maybe were on tractors, you know, in the summertime or in their parents' cellars. But we never talked about wine in school. I mean, we might steal bottles off the bottling line that we were slave labor for in the summertime and share with each other in the vineyard. So the wines that I might have been exposed to, Steve Burgess, we were friends and you know, cohorts in high school. I got to sneak tastes of Silver Oak next door because I was a babysitter for Justin and Bonnie Meyer for their 3 kids. But I didn't know anything about wine. I mean, I literally did not have, you know, this great education. I would love to say that I tasted the greats at a table, but I was not as lucky as that. I had to learn later, getting a job at Henry Wine Group and selling the likes of Kistler, Sonoma-Cutrer, Veuve Clicquot, and other great wines. Again, you know, we were not tasting these wines so much, but in the business of selling them to restaurants. But I get back to Groth in 1999 and realize that my parents lucked into the right place. Cabernet Sauvignon, the soils, and we should go back to our map here. There were really only, you know, 3 or 4 people making Cabernet at the time in Oakville. Robert Mondavi. The winery next door today is called Plumpjack, that you see there as the St. Eden Vineyard. This is all part of the brand that was once called Villemont Eden. So my parents, just kind of using location, tasting Cabernet Sauvignon from, you know, what was then Villemont Eden. Nils Vange would have been the winemaker in the 70s. And they loved the wine. They fell in love with it. So they fell in love with this property and quickly realized maybe we could make our way with Cabernet Sauvignon here. They did hire Nils Vange. He was our first vineyard manager, his first everything, general manager. He helped them plant more Cabernet, talking to Justin Meyer quite a bit about his Bonnie's vineyard that is still behind us today, and talking about the unique soils here. These soils really shouldn't be here. I should, you know, preface that too. This is part of an alluvial deposit that would have been here even before the Vaca mountain range, which is the mountain range to our direct east there. These are volcanic soils, and we find evidence of this particular soil in a marker stone called chert. Chert is actually a sedimentary stone formed out in the ocean, but it is unique in this area that it should be located in the Chiles River Valley, which is about 9 miles north and to the east of Groth. But it's, like I said, there's a mountain range in between me and that. So the geologists that we work with to kind of suss out our soils much later, not until 2000 did we think to actually find out something about the dirt we were working with. This Cabernet Sauvignon that we're trying is our 2016. We refer to this affectionately as the Oakville. Oakville AVA, quick history, wasn't formed until 1992. Why did it take so long? Really, Bob Mondavi and of course Joe Heitz, they had made their, you know, real stand in Napa Valley. They believed in it. Oddly enough, it was Tim Mondavi that really came up with the idea. He wanted to form an established AVA, American Viticultural Area, called the Rutherford Oakville Bench, that conveniently Mondavi owned most of. So the rest of us in the center of Oakville to the east of Oakville, I think my dad at the time, Gil Nickel, would have been Clark Swanson, Gene Phillips at Screaming Eagle, and Nyoko Dalavalli on the mountain said, hey, you know, we think we've got a unique, you know, ness to us on this side of Oakville as well. What say we do an appellation around the whole, throughout the town, throughout the belt, along the Oakville Crossroad, which of course is right in the heart there, in the middle. And so we formed the Oakville AVA in 1992. So both the Cabernet Sauvignons that Groth makes bear the Oakville AVA. That just means 85% or more has to come from this little tiny area of Oakville. We do grow quite a lot, about 60 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon, 3 clones, 2 rootstocks on our estate here. For this particular wine, we have so many wonderful friends and neighbors that we love doing business with. We actually buy some Cabernet Sauvignon a little bit from Ren Harris at his Paradigm Estate, which is way to the west, next to the Today family. As I mentioned earlier, they've been farming here 5 generations. And then Alex Fight-Borney on the east side, it's kind of tucked just to the south of Screaming Eagle there, and that is referred to as they call it the Game Ranch, because by the Fish and Game Department, oddly enough. But this gives us a breadth of Oakville. So Alex Fight-Borney's grapes on the east side are always the first to be harvested. They get the raw sun exposure. We're usually right up the middle. So probably, you know, it's always the last 2 weeks of October, or rather the last week of September, first 2 weeks of October for picking. And then the last grapes to always come in are from Ren Harris at Paradigm. And we do blend this with a touch of Merlot. The Merlot comes from our estate. We have another 44-acre parcel in the Oak Knoll AVA just to the south of us. That was purchased in 1982 as well for the Merlot planted there, because Nils, our first winemaker, was really looking for Merlot from that cooler zone, kind of give it a hint of that black pepper that's in the blend. And just recently, I've introduced about a 1/4 acre of Petit Verdot to our estate here. We are, in a place in our estate now where most of our vineyard is 25 to 35 years old. There is some, thought to the future. We had to remove some of the vines from our reserve block, which is a block that we farm on the west side of our property. And we had 5 years without making a reserve cab because for Groth, it's a selection from that part of the estate. So I never wanted to kind of be in that position again. So starting 4 years ago with Cameron Perry and our vineyard management team, we developed a plan to really attack the estate or take a look at renewing the estate 4 to 5 acres at a time. And what I've kind of discovered in this process is that we've never really done very much exploration of our soils and what else might grow here. And I'm really trying to think about, Cameron Perry, our director of winemaking since 2015, really wanted to broaden the palette a bit, put another color on the palette, as he likes to put it, with a touch of Petit Verdot. He had successfully worked with us at Chateau Montelena for 10 years and wanted to explore it on our estate here. So we're just now starting to kind of get into that with our 16 vintage. So it's exciting to see where we go.
No, it's amazing to see. You touched upon a couple of things that I think are so crucial to, I want to say corporate culture, but it's family culture. The reserve Cabernet, first man on the moon, first 100-point score assigned to an American wine, 1985. It's clearly that corner of the world that the ET game might have been the best thing that ever happened to your family, quite literally, to land there. But the fact that you have this out of the box success that no one had ever done before, but your family and your values were such that, well, we don't do that every year, even though you now have quite a license to print money, more or less. It's like you could, like in the sense that you could keep riding on this.
Sure. Yeah.
But you trust the consumer knows too much, then that you can't just keep selling a reserve Cabernet if it's not proving it to yourself that it truly is the stuff that you can the very best that you can bring to market. So I love that aspect.
Well, thank you. I think if you're at a big company, right? We mentioned some names earlier, corporations, it's at the board table. For Groth, it's at the dinner table. Okay, guys, what do you think? I don't think we can do it. We can't just call the rest of the vineyard reserve. We've been telling everybody for 25 years that the reserve has to come from the west side of the property because of the alluvial drainage and the rock that's over there, and it stresses the vineyard. I have to wake up in the morning and go out and do this every day, right? So it would be really hard to look yourself in the mirror and just, try and, shine everybody on. But yeah, it's a dinner table conversation, luckily.
Yeah, and the fact that you mentioned Cameron coming in, third winemaker in the whole trajectory of. Yeah,
we like to keep people. Yeah, I've got a lot of folks. I had a vineyard manager for our whole 40 years. It's a wonderful business to be in when you have that time to pass the baton. Catherine obviously is getting this luxury too. Catherine, you're young, and I'm old, so I'm 50 now. So enjoy the time with your dad, because I know we get a little frustrated, right? We want to make our stamp in the world and introduce our flavor and get in there. And I love my parents always slow me down to hey, we know you're excited, but be careful of, introducing this new thing over here, because then you might take away from an element over here. I mean, they've got the wisdom and the 40 years in the industry that I don't have. So I'm trying to still learn at their table as well, which I think is an important thing for me.
No, well said. And what I love about this whole conversation is it's starting to be like the very best part, like we are in wine country now, because yes, we would go on these familiarization trips and we come in and have our audience with each individual producer, but it's later on that day when all the producers got together and cross-pollinated around the table that we actually truly started to understand what the fabric of this place that we were jettisoned into was truly about. Because it's we just assume it's like, well, you see each other all the time, clearly. It's like, well, no, everyone's sticking home, even beyond the pandemic, not everyone's sticking home doing their knitting, because that's what makes this all kind of work. And so, no, thanks for that insight. And please stay close, because I know there's going to be questions, but I do want to get to Tegan before the it gets up. And and I don't even know where Tegan is right now. Where in the world is Tegan Pascalika? Where are you at? Are you in St. Helena? Where are we finding you today? Somewhere. On mute, maybe. Where are we?
Hey there. I'm currently at my house in the city of Napa, and in about 25 minutes, my first grader comes home from my parents, and he has a new first grade teacher. His current teacher is out on maternity leave, and his new first grade teacher is a retired school teacher named Bob Keg. And he grew up on the Keg dairy that Suzanne referenced, that, so that was his family's ranch. So my first grader's teacher right now is a guy who grew up there where Silver Oak and Groth is, and that was the Keg dairy. So kind of neat to put it all together. So I'm in Napa. We're actually bottling in St. Helena right now. And I scooted down to my house because it was just too loud in my office during bottling. So right after lunch, I'm going to zip back up there. But yeah, and if you want to kind of lead me on what the slides are, I actually don't even know what slides we have.
Well, we'll have the big reveal from Celeste, so we can take a look at. Do we dig right into past? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'll start with a little history of Turley wine cellars. So, kind of, trip in the wine industry. So Larry, go back to that first photo, actually, if you can go back right there. So that's the estate in St. Helena. So this is the property Larry bought in 1974. And a friend of his sister's, Helen, was trespassing and camping on the property back then, and Larry came home the first day he bought the property, and there was a tent set up. He was an emergency room doctor over in Santa Rosa and rode his motorcycle through the tent, and there was a guy in there, and Larry said, "What do you think you're doing?" He thought it was a hobo, and he said, "Well, I was just about to open a bottle of wine. Your sister said I could stay here." And that guy's name was John Williams, and he and Larry went on to start at what was called the Frog Farm. They started Frog's Leap. They started making wine a bit earlier, but 1981 was their first commercial release. And Larry and John ran Frog's Leap together until 93. And in 93, Larry split off and decided to focus on Old Vine, Zinfandel, and Petit Syrah. And, my joke is always that, being an ER doctor, Larry thinks he can save anything. So he really went after neglected, dilapidated old vineyards. And, he and John were the pioneers in Napa Valley of organic farming. The little vineyard at the estate is actually the first certified vineyard in Napa County at the Turley estate that was planted to Sauvignon Blanc by Larry, and he and John made wine from it. So through organic farming, Larry started Turley with 3 Zinfandels, 2 Petit Syrahs, and the estate Sauvignon Blanc back in 93. And then in 2019, we'll bottle 51 wines throughout the state. So primarily still Zinfandel and Old Vine Zinfandel. We make all the Zinfandels the same way. It's 20% new oak, native yeast fermentation, about 15 to 16 months in barrel. No fining and filtering unless we have to, and making 51 wines every couple years. There's a wine that I decide to filter. But on a whole, we don't filter anything. And in 2000, Larry bought the property that was known as Pizenti down in Paso Robles, and that's 50 acres of 1924 planted vines. And we kind of started sniffing around down there for other vineyards. And one of the vineyards that came available to us was the Uberoth Vineyard. And it's one of the oldest Zinfandel vineyards left in the state. It's planted in 1885. And it's up to 45-degree slopes. It's so steep that crawler tractors that have tank-like treads can only go up the vineyard. You can't till or spray downhill because it's too steep. The tractor can't stop. And it was planted in 1885. It's head trained and it's dry farmed, and it's not grafted. So it's planted on its own roots. So Vitis vinifera roots, which very few vineyards left in California or the world are on their own roots. But I think the reason that it has succeeded being own rooted is that the pHs in the soil are very, very high. So at the top of the hill of Ubroth, we get pHs about 8.9. And if you talk to someone from UC Davis, they would say you can't grow grapevines in that soil. And we have a bit of a different issue down at Ubroth. So this is one of the highest acid wines that we make. Rarely is the finished pH over 3.32. A lot of times it's under 3.3 finished. And because of there's kind of an inverse relation with the high pH soils and the low pH in the juice. And one of those things is when you're up above 8 pH, the uptake of potassium is really inhibited by the vine. So there's not a lot of potassium in the juice coming in. And if there's a picture of Ubroth, if you go back one slide, maybe forward one slide, sorry. Next one, right there. So that's the Ubroth vineyard. So it is, in my opinion, it's the most beautiful old vine vineyard in California. Again, some 45-degree slopes to the right. I mean, it doesn't look that steep. It's basically a peninsula. It's 16 acres that were planted in 1885. And you can kind of see the top spine of the hill. We actually have to wait. The first thing that we pick in the vineyard is actually the ripest fruit. And it's right at that top of the spine. And it's because the pH is too low, the acid is too high. And if we pick those grapes, I mean, we've had wines that haven't finished malolactic fermentation, but like the 2018 that we're drinking, a lot of the lots took about 13 months to finish malolactic. We don't inoculate for malo. And, at 3.2 pH and 15, the top part of the vineyard usually comes in at about 16.5 alcohol at 3.2 pH. So we kind of pick the top of the hill, so we have to stop looking at it. And then everything that comes in after the first pick is actually a little less ripe. So it's kind of the opposite. Usually when people pick, they pick early, and that's the fresher. And, the first pick is extremely, extremely fresh just due to the extremely high acid. And so the 16 acres, we usually get around, 30, 32 tons. I think we got 30 tons in 2018. And we pick it about 7 or 8 times. I mean, we've picked up to 12 times, which is a lot to pick. We really kind of just focus on block by block. You can see all the different exposures in the vineyard. I mean, there have been years where the 16 acres, we've picked almost a month from the first pick to the last. It's a really, we have other vineyards that are 16, 20 acres that you kind of start picking and you finish in 3 or 4 days. And, this vineyard's so special that all the different exposures and, if you get rain, if you don't, Paso Robles is a hot area. And, but the thing is, we're really close to the ocean. So we have down in Paso, you have the highest diurnal shifts in, a quality California wine grape growing area. So we'll see shifts up, we'll be at the really hot days when you hit the 105, we can be in the 40s that night. You can see 50, 60 degree shifts diurnal. And that really, helps shut the vines down, preserve acidity. It's a really special place to grow grapes. And, the big part of what we do, and I think one of the common threads through all of the producers today is time, and the reality is, doesn't matter how much money you have in Burgundy, like you can't plant an old vineyard. So Turley's really been able to benefit and reap the rewards of all the things everyone else has been talking about, this thoughtfulness, this planting the right thing, figuring it out, and being able to work with 130, 90-year-old, 80-year-old vines that are still in the ground. I mean, there have been so many changes since 1885 in viticulture and winemaking in California. And why did this vineyard stay in the ground? Like, those are always the questions when you look at these little kind of these vineyards, it's just so amazing that you get to work with things that were planted that long ago. And they just, you can set your watch to them. You see how they grow. And, our oldest vineyards during the drought did the best. It's the youngest vineyards that seem to suffer the most. And it's not that the yields weren't lower in older vineyards, but just pure vine health, and the vigor of the vines. And every time we have these major heat experiences or drought experiences, or even, these amazing rainfalls, I always go back and look historically, and I think, oh my God, this year we had 11 inches of rain in Paso, which the average rainfall down there and we had 11 inches in 3 days. And the average rainfall is 16 inches. And then you go back and look and it's like, okay, we had that in like the 60s as well. And these heat spikes, it's like, okay, those happened in the 40s. And, you look at all of these things that we like to believe, and I'm a firm believer in climate change, but you like to believe that you're kind of mind blown that you're experiencing this in your lifetime. And then when you go and look 130 years before, it's happened 3 times. It may be happening a bit more in a regular sequence now, but these vines have actually been through that. I haven't been through that. I'm more stressed out than the vines. When you're walking these vineyards during a drought and there's no irrigation. So it's tightrope with no net. Like you get 6 inches of rain in a year, and the vines, it's kind of like, suck it up, tough luck, and let's see how you do. And, the vines have been through it before. So I think that's one of the most special parts about working with vines of these age. And you look at the exposures and the way it's planted, it's just, it's pretty amazing.
I love the outlook because I can't imagine the minutia that's going on in your brain with 51 different vineyards to have to worry about, let alone, on a cellular level, it seems that you need to be that concerned. Uberoth, that picture speaks a million words. What an amazing sight, and loves how it comes through in the glass. So heads up, Brent, your time is coming. Maybe slime is coming, but who knows? But Tegan, one of the things that strikes me about your history, because your 2003, you started in the vineyards at Turley, and kind of thankfully start amassing knowledge to come to the point where you are now kind of in charge of all of this trust of a great vineyard and its application. But during that time, Turley goes through a seismic shift, not, I don't think, in the farming in any way, shape, or form, but what we're receiving in the bottle isn't nearly that SUV-sized Zinfandel experience. They've got grace and charm, and
I would disagree with you. It's all with the farming, to be honest.
Okay.
And when you farm a vineyard and you do all the right things at all the right times, the confidence that gives you is, I think all of the producers here having confidence as a wine maker, grower, that that you've done everything. And my favorite Oakville story that kind of involves a bit of the Groth lore is an ex-girlfriend worked for Nils Vengi back in 2006. And he was making Carter To Kalon Cabernet, and he picked it at 23.2 bricks, which in 2006, everyone can remember, was not what people should be picking the most expensive fruit in Napa Valley at. Another friend was working at another winery who made To Kalon Cabernet. They picked it at 32 bricks. And like 3 or 4 years later, I was in the dentist chair office waiting to get in, and the wine spectator was there, and I opened it up. They reviewed both wines, and the 23 brick wine got 95 points, and the 32 brick wine got 99 points. And I tell people what it taught me that day was that with great vineyards, you have a 9 brick differential to make great wine. The style will be very different, but great vineyards that are farmed properly, like you can pick at 21.5, you can pick at 28 bricks, you can still make great wine. And what that taught me is that we had to up our game farming. We had to, be more fastidious on timing and more thoughtful in the vineyard. And then, the picking decision, everything was done. You had this confidence to pick earlier, with the same ripeness, in my opinion. You weren't waiting on anything. And I think that's the biggest change, is what we've done in the vineyard.
Nice. And I think one last thing, because I'm conscious of time, and but these wonderful old vineyards that you have, but I think about the wine that we might see more often because it's more accessible, that lovely juveniles bottling that you do, that to me, with the replants in many of those sites, and to me it is one of those things that proves that aphorism that old vineyards aren't great because they're old. They're great because they're old because they were great.
Great, for
So
sure.
you see those younger plantings, they still have this pop to them, and there's something so special there, not just because of the grape variety and not just because of the California sun. There's more to it than that.
Well, and that was an argument Larry and I got into early, because I told him I took the juvenile more seriously than any of the other wines. And I think he took him back, because he said, no, but you got to, and I said, those wines do their own thing. You know what I mean? Ubroth, Hain, Rattle, those wines do their own thing. Like, that's not much of like juvenile. You are trying to make as good of a $20 bottle of Zinfandel as you can. And again, you have great sites. I mean, I think there's a real reciprocal relationship when you replant misses in vineyards of 100 years of age. I liken it to bringing young children into like an old person's home. Everyone perks up. There's competition, there's new life in the soil. And I think people don't realize that, but as a farmer, you have to pay more attention, because you have young children in the vineyard before you have people that kind of do their own thing and you can forget about. And then it brings this sense of attention to the site that you have to, be out there caring after these replants and these young vines. And I think, both the young vines and the old vines really benefit from that kind of replanting. There was a long time in California wine that people didn't believe that you could do interplantings in old vine vineyards. So they just kind of, and then eventually enough vines died, they just decided to rip it out.
No, it's just fun to see. Brent, how are you feeling?
Well, no slime yet, thankfully. All of these wines are just stupendous examples of their varieties. So much complexity, layers to all of these wines. And Tegan, I found it interesting. Your head was like, how did this vineyard sort of last so long? I think, how did someone ever think to plant it there in the first place? You go back 100, 125 years, right? These are sort of these mountainside vineyards. It's not, there's no road to get up there. You've got to basically clear your own way. And so I always am interested about the history. But in the glass, I mean, Christopher Seeley mentioned the acidity. I mean, it's just mind blowing to have, a Zin that has this much sort of vibrancy and freshness, but this mix of sort of black fruits. I get a little almost citric quality to it as well.
Oh, for sure.
But it's almost a little ferrous as well, like a little irony, and lots of floral notes to it. I mean, it's just, such it's very wonderful to try an example of something, that is this, special.
Thank you very much. I have two young boys, and I bring them out to vineyards in Napa and Paso. And, it's one of those things where, I tell them, like, there'll be a time when, like, they'll tell their friends, be like, oh, my dad used to be able to make wine from 130-year-old vines. And the way American viticulture is now, that probably won't be the case in 50 years. That just won't, there aren't a lot of vineyards that are kind of coming up, and things are changing really quickly. And I just feel really fortunate that, I get to work with these vineyards, because when you look at them and you work with some younger vineyards, these just know what to do at the right moment. You know, they're like these seasoned stage actors that you're like, oh, you need to turn left now. And it's like, they did it. Like everything they do throughout the year, you know, you really stress about, and then they do it. And it's just a real treat to be able to work with vineyards of this age. And, you know, again, we farm everything organically, which is really special. You know, I've never sprayed, you know, a non-organic chemical, which is a pretty neat thing. You know, I wasn't in farming before working at Turley, so I'm really lucky that I can say that.
Nice. It's we're probably up to time as much as here's Paula, but Paula, I think we're ready for hour 2. Now we're just
I
actually
know, you guys are just getting warmed up.
going.
Like I didn't even want to jump on here because I'm fascinated by this discussion, and I feel bad that we didn't have a 2-hour time slot. We could have kept going and going. But before we end, guys, there's one more question on the Heritage Vine, the Old Vine Zinfandel Heritage Project, and where they're at with that. Does anybody on this call know that? Tegan,
So
you know where we're at with that?
it's actually called the Historic Vineyard Society, and it's not just Zinfandel. So it's any vines in California planted over 50 years ago. We started it, and it's a nonprofit. We started in 2010, and our goal is to educate the consumer and the public about historic vineyards in California, and of course preserve them as well. But it's very education focused. We usually do a tour and dinner every year. We do sometimes where we do a region where we'll tour 4 vineyards and then have a dinner, and then other times we'll do an intensive where we focus on one vineyard that multiple producers over time have made wine from. And of course, we haven't been able to do one in the last year, but we've been doing a couple of Zoom tastings locally in Northern California where people can come pick up the wines, and we do a seminar very like this. So you can check it out. Rob just posted it. It's historicvineyardsociety.org. It's a really fun kind of website to peruse if you're up for it.
Thanks, Tegan. Guys, this has been absolutely a fantastic and fascinating, what is it now, 60, 70 minutes. So I want to thank you all for your time and for your passion and for your love of California wines and sharing that message with us. We really appreciate it. Chris, you did a great job trying to keep everybody on track, but it was so interesting. We could have just kept going and going. So you did a great job. And Brent, thanks for being on the hot seat and having everybody try to slam you, but I think you held your own quite well. And we wish you all safe, healthy, and happy until we can all come and visit you in California once the jobs get in us here in Canada. So thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next month at California Wine Month in Canada. So thanks again, everyone. Rob and Alex, thanks for all your help in putting this together. It's a fantastic hour. Fantastic.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Catherine.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Chris. Thanks, Paula. Rob, great to see you. Tegan, thanks for that. That was mind-blowing. I need to know.
The wine exchange was awesome. That was super appreciated, guys. Thank you very much.
Everybody,
We're
thank you.
thirsty here. We're thirsty.
Come to California.
Amazing wine.
Thanks, everyone.
Jeff, thanks for making the suggestion on the wine exchange.
Bye-bye.
That was awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.